Welcome once again to the Economic Liberty Lecture Series. I'm Bart Frazier, Program Director at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're the co-sponsors of this event along with the GMU Econ Society. I'll make my introduction very short here. David's going to introduce David Boaz. But just to give you a few updates on what we're doing, we have, if you've been to our website and seen the libertarian angle, we are doing a week-long tour of the Northeast, 5 colleges in the Northeast, starting at Grove City, heading to Penn State, then to Binghamton, University of New York at Albany, and then University of Vermont in Burlington. All those videos will be online following. Oh no, I take that back. I'm sorry. We're not doing videos of those, but we do have weekly videos of the libertarian angle on our website to view if you want an idea what that's like. Also, this Econ Liberty Lecture Series, we have one more installment this month. This is going to be the last this semester. Walter Block is going to be April 28th. It's going to be done by Skype. It's going to be in the Johnson Center Cinema downstairs. And also, if you're unfamiliar with us, please go to our website and check us out. We've got a monstrous website with over 3,000 original articles, several hundred videos. We also have a monthly journal that we've been putting out for close to 20 years. It's free for the asking up here. And also a daily FFF daily newsletter that is free for the asking. If you just send an email to fff@fff.org with the subject line subscribe, we'll go ahead and sign you up for that. And with that, I'll introduce David Roth from the GMU Econ Society.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Roth, the president of the Economic Society here at Mason. The Econ Society is a student organization dedicated to the personal, professional, and academic development of all students interested in economics. If you'd like to learn more about us, please speak to me after the event or visit our blog at economics-society.org. It's my pleasure to introduce David Boaz. David Boaz is the Executive Vice President of Cato Institute and has played a key role in the development of the Cato Institute and the libertarian movement. He is a provocative commentator and a leading authority on domestic issues such as education choice, drug legalization, the growth of government, and the rise of libertarianism. Boaz is the former editor of the New Guard magazine and was the executive director of the Council for a Competitive Economy prior to joining Cato in 1981. He is the author of Libertarianism, a premiere described by the LA Times as a well-researched manifesto of libertarian ideas, the editor of the Libertarian Reader, and co-editor of the Cato Handbook for Policymakers. His articles have been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, National Review, and Slate. He is a frequent guest on national television and radio shows, and he has appeared on ABC's Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, CNN's Crossfire, NPR's Talk of the Nation, and All Things Considered, John McLaughlin's One-on-One, Fox News Channel, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other media. His latest book is Politics of Freedom. Join me in welcoming David Boaz.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure always to be at George Mason. It's a pleasure to be back after many years at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I think we recently posted a video of an appearance I did down at the National Press Club for FFF some years ago. I have agreed to talk tonight on capitalism versus socialism, even though, number one, I'm not an economist, so I'm just kind of winging it, and number two, nobody believes in socialism anymore. But maybe as we talk about the principles that distinguish capitalism and socialism, we will realize that although nobody claims to be a socialist, nobody advocates real socialism anymore, some of those principles are still relevant to political and economic debates that we have today. So if we're going to talk about capitalism versus socialism, the first question is, what is capitalism? A lot of people don't think capitalism is a good word for the system of free markets. Market exchange, the rule of law, liberty. A lot of people don't like the word capitalism because capital isn't the essential thing that distinguishes it from other systems. I like Adam Smith's term, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Let people alone, let them make their own decisions so long as we say, they don't hit each other or take each other's stuff, and that is capitalism. That's what naturally emerges. We could say capitalism is what happens when you let people alone. If you let people alone, they each have something or they produce something and they discover that it's better to be able to exchange it, and as they start exchanging it, more exchanges happen and more growth happens, and that is capitalism. Another thing Adam Smith said, besides the obvious and simple system of natural liberty, was little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Now, as you can see, Adam Smith was a moderate, not a real libertarian. He favored easy taxes, not no taxes. He favored a tolerable administration of justice, not a really good administration of justice, but he understood if you had peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, you were likely to take your state from barbarism to opulence. Perhaps more, in a more dictionary way, we might say capitalism is an economic system in which investment in and ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange of wealth is made and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations. It's interesting, I went around looking for a formal definition of capitalism, and I had trouble finding one that I actually liked. You look in the dictionary and you get something you don't really like. You look in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it doesn't seem quite right. But that one seems close enough to me. Now, that defines what capitalism is, in my view: free exchange based on private property, individual liberty to create, innovate, and exchange. What is it not? Well, it's not a lot of the things that people think it is. It is not cronyism. It is not a system of big businesses. It is not a system maintained by the Federal Reserve Board and its creation of money from thin air. It is not the protection of big businesses. And this is something people get wrong a lot, mostly people on the left who are critical of libertarians and people who believe in free markets, sometimes even people on the right who think they are pro-free enterprise, pro-capitalism, and that ends up being, in their view, pro-business. So it's just important to note businesses are something that happens in a free market. They're not the goal of the free market. They're not the goal of a free political system. And it's certainly not the goal of a free political system to protect incumbent businesses from competition, to prevent people from competing with businesses, and so on. Maybe the most important question about how economics works, how capitalism works, is a question Bastiat asked in the 19th century in France, and that was, how does Paris get fed? Every morning, the people of Paris get milk and bread and meat and so on. How does that happen? They're not farmers. We understand how farmers get fed. They plant seeds, the crops grow, they cut them down, they eat them. How does the city get fed? And obviously it isn't just Paris. How does New York get fed? How does Los Angeles get fed? And in particular, who plans it? People always want to know, intellectuals in particular, who plans how to get the proper amount of milk and bread and eggs and meat to Paris every day. Milton Friedman was in China once, and he told the story about how he met with the Minister of the Economy. And you don't get to be Minister of the Economy in a 5,000-year-old bureaucracy based on tests and really merit unless you're a pretty smart guy. So this very smart guy at the head of the Chinese meritocracy said to Milton Friedman, who is responsible for materials distribution in the United States? Well, that's a very good question, because it looks like the United States has a whole lot of materials, a high standard of living, and if you're the Chinese Minister of Economy, you would like to know who's responsible. Maybe you could talk to him, get some tips. Friedman indicated that for once in his life he was speechless. How do you answer a question like that? Who is responsible for materials distribution in the United States? And he said he thought about saying the Chicago Board of Trade. That's sort of true, some materials. But he had to try to explain that the reason the United States is rich is that no one is in charge of materials distribution. It happens through the process of exchange, of what Adam Smith called truck and barter, of free market competition. People making decisions in their own interest. People acting in their own self-interest and then led as if by an invisible hand to make decisions that end up benefiting the whole society, though that was not their intention. And of course, what economists have learned as they've studied over the past couple of years, what is capitalism, how does it work, is that no one could plan it. And I'll talk about that a little later. When societies have tried to plan the distribution of materials, it has not worked out well. You can see how, if you're Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Ira Magazine are sitting around Yale and Harvard when you're in college, you look at the chaos of the free market. There's 3 pizza places opening on one corner. That can't be efficient. If only one opened, then all the resources being spent by the others could be spent for something more socially beneficial. So if you're Ira Magaziner, you say, I could come up with a plan. We'll figure out how many pizza places are needed and also how many cold fusion projects and how many steel plants, and then we'll decide where they ought to go, and that'll be so much more efficient. But what we've learned, some economists by introspection and logical deduction, and other people by painful experience and history, is that nobody can plan complex systems. And that is a very difficult lesson for people to learn, especially, I think, intellectuals. Intellectuals understand it takes a lot of planning to make plans come together. It took a lot of planning to create this event. It took a lot of planning to create this university. It took a lot of planning to create the corporations that made the microphones and the cameras and the chairs and tables, the automobile that I drove to get here. It takes a lot of planning to make each one of those things. But it turns out when you try to plan the whole society, it does not work out well. The economist Paul Hayne told a story many years ago about the San Francisco Bay Area, where he said there are 3 major airports in the San Francisco Bay Area. Planes take off every minute of the day, and air traffic controllers centrally plan these takeoffs. You don't take off without a scheduled slot and permission on the spot to take off or to land. Very complex process coordinated by the officers of the FAA. But, he said, in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are many more automobile trips every day than there are airplane trips. And as it turns out, it would be impossible to try to plan all the automobile trips in the San Francisco Bay Area. It seems very complex to regulate and plan all the air travel, but that's actually a very simple task compared to all the automobile trips. And so what did he say? What have we discovered? We've discovered that a few simple rules. Drive on the right, stop at stop signs, yield to people turning, a few rules like that, and you can have millions of people driving every day in the San Francisco Bay Area, sometimes not very fast, but at least with a very small number of accidents as long as you obey these very simple rules. So contrary to our initial impression, it's actually the less complex systems that can be planned and the more complex systems that must develop spontaneously. This was sort of a point Murray Rothbard made many years ago, that people like to tell us that as society gets more complex, we need more planning. But in fact, he said, society just practiced agriculture for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And you could have sort of planned that because it wasn't changing very much. It's precisely the complexity of the industrial age and then the service industries and then the information age. Those are the things that are too complex to plan. One of the crucial elements of a capitalist system is the role of prices and private property. The price system in a market economy is a kind of information system. A key insight that economists have pointed out, and some people have even said that makes the price system a First Amendment issue. The wage and price controls are arguably censorship because they are depriving every participant in the economy of important information. The price system in a market economy guides economic activity so flawlessly that most people don't appreciate its importance. Market prices are transmitting this information about relative scarcity and then efficiently coordinating economic activity. Every price contains vitally important information about other people's wants and other people's resources. What's available and what do people want? Are things more valuable over here than they are over here? Prices tell us all of those things. Pull together the information that is available. Now, it will never be the case that all the information an entrepreneur might like to have will be available anywhere, but the price system is the best mechanism for pulling it together and making that information usable to both producer and consumer, because each price contains within it information about consumer demands and about costs of production, ranging from the amount of labor needed to produce the item to the cost of labor to the bad weather on the other side of the world that is raising the price of the raw materials that will be needed to produce the product. And rather than having to know all those details, the entrepreneur at every stage of the process is presented with a simple number. The price tells him a lot about what he needs, what he can't afford. So the point of an economy is not just to produce more things. This is one of the Soviet errors. They thought that if you produced more ships or more trucks, you had an improving economy. But the point is to produce more things that people want. And prices are very good at telling us what things people want and what they don't want so much of anymore if their desires have changed. In order to have workable prices, we need private property, or some of the classical liberals like to call it several property, meaning property divided among many owners. What are the benefits of private property? Well, first, people take better care of what they own. There's an old joke, nobody ever washes a rented car. Well, it depends partly on how long you're going to retain it, but there's something to that. People take better care of what they own. That's why people ask for a security deposit before you rent something. Nobody asks you for a security deposit when you buy a house. They assume that you'll take care of it, and if you don't, you will bear the cost in the end. So this is why Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize public housing, because she knew that people would take better care of it. Instead of the government having to constantly maintain this supply of housing, owners would take care of it better. In addition, several property diffuses power. If one body, the city, the state, the national state, owns all the property, then it really has all the power. It can decide whether you have a place to live or not. When you have several property, private property, then everybody's got a little bit of power. Everybody's either got a piece of property or they've got many people bidding for their purchase of property. So all of those things are the way several property diffuses power. It also protects liberty. A man's home is his castle. Now, we could talk all day about the ways in which it is not true in modern America or in any other modern country that a man's home is truly his castle. But the principle there, that I can stop you at my door, that you can't come in, that you can't come onto my property without my permission, which I'm usually willing to arrange under reasonable circumstances, but it protects each person. Each person has something if he has a piece of property. And again, even if you don't have a piece of property, the fact that millions of people have property means that property is diffused. It's not all owned in one place. And it makes possible exchange. And as I was saying, it produces the information that you need for rational exchange, but also it makes possible the very act of exchange. If you don't know what you have and you don't know what I have, then how are we going to engage in exchange that will be mutually beneficial? The people on the left like to talk about cooperation instead of competition. George Soros writes about this a lot. I believe in an economy based on cooperation. Libertarians believe in cooperation so much that we want to create social institutions that make it possible. Social institutions like private property, free market exchange, sanctity of contracts, the rule of law, those are the institutions that make cooperation possible. If I don't know what I have and you don't know what you have, then we really are in a war of all against all. We just grab for what we can get, and the more powerful are likely to get more. In addition, the market values of different pieces of property reflect the preferences and demands of the rest of society. So, in some sense, when you have a piece of property, you're constantly thinking about what other people might be interested in. How much would they value this piece of property? Would they buy it from me for a price I'd be willing to take? Can I use my property to make something that other people would like? Could I make money if I do that? If you use your property in one way, you are forsaking other uses. And from an economist's point of view, you are forsaking the highest valued alternative use, whether that is selling it to a big corporation or using it to grow apples or whatever the next best thing you might do beyond the property you have. So as Armin Alchian, the great economist at UCLA, said, this creates an interesting paradox. Although property is called private, those private decisions are based on public or social evaluation. That is, every day you think in some way about whether you could be using your property in a way that you would find more beneficial, which for many of us might mean making more money. It doesn't necessarily, but you're thinking about those alternatives, and therefore you're constantly taking into account what other people want. That's also part of how do you create cooperation. All right, so all of that is sort of what is capitalism. Now we should ask, what is socialism? And socialism can have different meanings, but let's start with what I think is the real meaning of socialism: the abolition of private property, markets, and prices. The people own all the resources in society. Now we understand the people, all million or 300 million of them, can't make decisions, so somebody will have to exercise control. But in theory, the people own all these things. That's what Lenin wanted. Lenin was a dedicated aspirer to power, but he was also a dedicated socialist. He believed that the way to make a better world was to abolish prices, markets, and private property. Very few people ever actually believed in that or tried to implement it. But let's think of something that's kind of close to that. How about the system they had in East Germany? And we could say versus the system they had in West Germany. Neither of them a perfect archetype. But in East Germany, all the property was owned, the major property. People owned toothbrushes, but all real property, land, buildings, and so on, owned by the state, and supposed to be operated in the interests of all the people, and again, efficiently, because a committee of experts would decide what's the most efficient way to make cars, refrigerators, and so on. In West Germany, most property was owned privately, owned by individuals. They were allowed to exchange, prices floated freely, and so on. Now, again, not entirely private, not entirely free exchange, free prices, but still mostly private and free. And there were huge differences in what happened. The classic difference that I like to cite is you took the German people. They're the same people, same language, same history, same culture, and you divided them down the middle. And you ran a sort of socialist system on one side and a sort of capitalist system on the other side. And one good way to capture what the difference is in West Germany, they produced the Volkswagen, the Audi, the BMW, the Mercedes. In East Germany, they produced the Trabant, a car that you had to wait 4 years to get, and when you got it, you could hear it coming down the street when you were finally getting one, because it's putting the whole way even when it's new. Classic example of, boy, markets work a lot better than an attempt to transcend markets. Now, if you have professors who say socialism would be better than what we have, they're probably not thinking of Leninist socialism. They're probably not even thinking of East German socialism. They're probably thinking of what they think is Swedish socialism. So Sweden versus the United States is sort of the political battle being played out in the world today. Sweden versus the United States is not that huge a difference. Sweden doesn't have that much more real socialism than the United States. What it does have is, at least over the past 50 years, a higher level of taxes and transfers. So they have more or less a market economy, more or less freedom of labor, freedom of capital, freedom of trade, international trade, but they tax people pretty heavily, and they have high levels of transfer payments, welfare, disability payments, retirement, health care, and so on. If you are the Soviet Union and you're thinking about what to come out of socialism to, Sweden versus the United States, not very different. But in our political distinctions, it is different. And there we can say, well, Western Europe, yes, in many ways free, prosperous, less prosperous than the United States. A Swedish think tank did a study recently of where would Sweden rate if it were a state of the United States? And the answer is it would be about the 40th wealthiest state in the United States. And other European countries also sort of in the bottom half of American states. And that's with relatively narrow distinctions between U.S. capitalism and Swedish capitalism. Now, another definition of socialism, and one that we should not forget, is the one that was propagated by a political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It's usually abbreviated as Nazi, but it was in fact a National Socialist Party. There was a competition in Germany in the 1920s between different kinds of socialists. There was the Communist Party, there were Social Democrats, there was the National Socialist Workers' Party. And it did see itself as a socialist party because it wanted to operate the economy in the interests of all the people. Now, to some extent, they had seen what happened in the Soviet Union. They saw that didn't work very well. They had an idea that maybe you could keep the businesses in private hands, just have them directed by the state. But they were a socialist party. However, you are not going to encounter any socialist who says what he likes is the National Socialist German Workers' Party platform. But it's interesting to keep in mind that was a socialist thing. Robert Heilbroner defines socialism as a centrally planned economy in which the government controls all means of production. That is what socialism really means, and it's what we should think about when we make these overall comparisons. There are three big problems with socialism. The first one is the incentive problem. Second is the knowledge problem. Third is the totalitarian problem. Talk about the incentive problem. The failure of socialism in countries around the world can be traced to one critical defect. It is a system that ignores incentives. In a free enterprise economy, you know that the fruits of your labor are yours to enjoy. In socialism, you work for anyone else, and the laziness of any one man will have only a minuscule effect on total output. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that I know that if I don't do any work, it's not really going to affect the way anybody else eats. So why should I work very hard? But you too are going to figure out that if you don't do any work, it's not going to really affect the total amount of food available to the society. So why should you work very hard? And in the end, nobody has an incentive to work very hard. And we have seen this in societies from ancient times to the early American colonies to modern welfare states where there is a disincentive effect created by the fact that there are all these welfare programs available. Also slavery. Thomas Sowell says one of the terrible effects of slavery was to convey to black people that working hard wasn't going to make you any better off, and to white people that working hard was not fit work for gentlemen. So he said, one of the reasons the South remained poor for 100 years after the Civil War is this bad attitude toward work on the part of everybody in the South. Second, there's a knowledge problem. It is the absence of market prices that makes it impossible to figure out how to use society's scarce resources. When you have market prices, you can get the sense, people want more refrigerators, apparently more than they want more cars. So let's sell. We don't even have to decide, I think I will sell my metal to the refrigerator company. You just do because the price goes up, and they're the ones who are still bidding at that price. Mises pointed this out in the 1920s. It took a long time for other people to accept that that really was the problem. Socialists often considered the problem of production an engineering problem. Just figure out what's most efficient and then do that. It's true that an engineer can answer a specific question about the production process. Which would transmit electricity better? Silver, gold, platinum, copper. Well, the answer is silver and platinum would do better. Why don't we use silver and platinum in our electric wires? Because they're really expensive. And it turns out copper will do a better job for the money. So that's something an engineer can't tell you. Only the market process can tell you how much additional quality is worth how much additional investment. Delivers the best results for the cost. And a million decisions like that being made every day are what create economic growth. You could take a poll if you're a socialist and ask people whether they'd rather have refrigerators or cars, but economists have learned that asking people questions in polls doesn't really determine what they will do when it's actually their money on the line. Ask people whether there should be more healthy food and less unhealthy food available. They'll say yes. Put both in the grocery store and see what people buy. Well, it won't be quite the same answer. So those are the kinds of things that you need market prices to figure out. What combination of resources is the best way to achieve the greatest output given any amount of resources? You can't do that in a theoretical model. You have to have prices. Socialism doesn't have the prices. In practice, in the Soviet Union, which is sort of the classic example, at least in the modern world when we've been studying these things, of trying to implement socialism, what actually happened? Well, factory managers learned that they had to establish illegal markets among themselves. They would call each other up and say, I've got some extra copper. Do you have some extra rubber? And they would start exchanging things like that. They couldn't use money prices, so they developed these marvelously complex systems. Soviet economists identified at least 80 different media of exchange, from vodka to ball bearings to motor oil to tractor tires. The closest thing Americans have ever seen to such a clumsy system is Radar O'Reilly on the telephone in MASH. He's on the phone calling other MASH bases saying, we have whiskey, do you have penicillin? We have penicillin, do you have ball bearings? Maybe he would trade 3 or 4 different MASH units would do this. It's an admirable skill. But imagine trying to run a whole economy like that. That's what the Soviet Union was doing. They were having Radar O'Reillys run their economy. And then the third problem with the socialism is the totalitarian problem, and that is those with the power make the decisions. And on what basis are they going to make the decisions? Well, we've just talked about the fact that they don't have any good signals. They don't know what the right decisions are. So the logical thing is they're going to make them in the interests of their friends, their colleagues, the people with political power. Political clout is the way you will make those decisions. And you know, in some cases, it's not even that in their own mind they're doing the wrong thing. If you don't know what's the right thing to do, then why not give the resources to somebody you trust? Why not give the resources to somebody you know needs them? Why not give the resources to somebody you believe will do a good job? Because you don't have any prices, you can't tell. One difference, one of the things I wrote in Libertarianism, a primer, a lot of people picked up on, is one difference between libertarian and socialism is that a socialist society can't tolerate groups of people practicing freedom, but a libertarian society can comfortably allow people to choose voluntary socialism. In a free society, we say, you want to create a communal farm and live that way? Personally, I don't think it'll be very efficient. I don't think you'll grow very much food, but it's your business. You want to do that? You can do that. Create a socialist community. Just don't expect other people to bail you out or anything like that. Now, take that point and then note the irony. Who made it possible for Michael Moore to make his movie Capitalism a Love Story? Well, the answer is it was very successful capitalists. Specifically, it was Paramount Vantage, which is controlled by the massive media company Viacom, in association with the Weinstein Company, which had recently raised $490 million through Goldman Sachs. So a corollary to the point I was making is You can bet that in a socialist society they will not allocate any resources to make anti-socialist movies. But in a capitalist society, the capitalists will happily allocate resources to make anti-capitalist movies if they think they can make a profit on them. And if you doubt that a socialist society would discriminate against anti-socialist movies, you can either observe socialism in practice in Cuba, China, the Soviet Union, East Germany, Venezuela now, or you could read the words of Robert Heilbroner. Robert Heilbroner was one of the best-selling economists of the late 20th century. Maybe not one of the greatest theoretical economists, but he was a wonderful writer, and millions of college students read his work. Maybe you still do. He wrote a popular book about what economics is, but he also wrote in socialist magazines like Dissent, and he wrote a very interesting article maybe 30 years ago in Dissent, in which he said, socialism must depend for its economic direction on some form of planning, and for its culture on some form of commitment to the idea of a morally conscious collectivity. Some form of command is the necessary means for securing the continuance and adaptation of the socialist order. Indeed, that is what planning means. The factories and stores and farms and shops of a socialist socioeconomic formation must be coordinated, and this coordination must entail obedience to a central plan. Now, so far you might say, well, that's just economics. What do you expect? But he was honest enough to go on and say, the rights of individuals to their million liberties, that is, the liberties described by John Stuart Mill, are directly opposed to the basic social commitment to a deliberately embraced collective moral goal. Under socialism, every dissenting voice raises a threat similar to that raised under a democracy by those who preach anti-democracy, unquote. So Heilbroner is saying not just that you can't have businessmen out there defying the economic plan, he's saying you can't have intellectuals out there raising a dissenting voice against the plan and the collective, because it will undermine the plan and the collective system. That's honest, at least. Most socialists are not willing to acknowledge that that's what their system would require. Now, we should note that real socialism was really tried only once. It was tried by Lenin from 1917 to 1921. In history books, it's usually called war communism. You blame its failure on the war. Don Lavoie, the great George Mason economist, is the person who taught me it was not war communism, it was communism. That was what they wanted, the abolition of prices, markets, and private property. And in 4 years, even the Bolsheviks were able to figure out this is a disaster. We can't keep doing this. And so they created the new economic plan, which was to allow a little more reliance on prices, whatever those prices were, so that they would know what was going on. And then, of course, it turned into Stalin's forced collectivization and Gosplan, the whole plan for the society, and it never worked. But it wasn't quite as disastrous. People didn't starve the way they did under actual communism. They were hungry, but they didn't do that. Heilbroner noted that the crucial missing element in the communism of 1920 was not so much information as the incentive to act on information. He said, a capitalist firm responds to changing prices because failure to do so will cause it to lose money. A socialist ministry ignores changing inventories because bureaucrats learn that doing something is more likely to get them in trouble than doing nothing. So that was the problem that they had. But that was real socialism. Nobody defends real socialism anymore. So let me talk for a minute about what is the real challenge to libertarianism and capitalism and free markets, or freed markets, as some people like to say. It's not really socialism. It's modified capitalism or social democracy. In Europe, you'll still find some people, social democrats, who call themselves democratic socialists, but they rarely favor nationalizing the means of production. They favor regulations, more taxes and transfers, more guidance of the economy, but not real socialism. The same principles still apply. There's the incentive problem. Taxes and transfers distort incentives. If you tax work and wealth, you will get less work and wealth. If you subsidize non-work, you will get more non-work. So that is still there. They discourage work, they discourage investment, they encourage sloth and rent-seeking. It's not just not work, it's get money from the government rather than through the free market. So even modified socialism, even social democracy of the American kind, suffers from all the same incentive problems, though not as great. The knowledge problem. Prices tell us what people want and how to best fulfill their wants. Price controls, regulations, subsidies, bailouts, all of those things assume that someone in Washington knows what should be produced better than the intricate market process. So again, if you don't destroy markets and prices and private property, you will have a functioning economy. But it won't function as well. And the higher the taxes, the more convoluted the regulations, the more all-encompassing the subsidies and the direction and the partial planning, then the more you will slow down economic growth. Now, capitalism is such a powerful engine of growth that we can do a lot of damage to it and we still get economic growth. Not nearly as much as I think we could, not nearly as much as I think Europe could, but we still get growth. And in a way, that's a problem. Makes it harder to explain what's wrong with democratic socialism or social democracy because we do still mostly get richer every year. And then there's still the totalitarian problem. As Hayek wrote in The Road to Serfdom, as the coercive power of the state will alone decide who is to have what, the only power worth having will be a share in the exercise of this directing power. Now, we have not reached the point where only the state, where the power of the state alone makes these decisions. But to the extent that we allow the state to make more decisions, to allocate more resources through more subsidies, regulations, and so on, then more political allocation means more power in Washington, more effort expended to get a piece of that power. People fear to challenge a government that is big enough to give you all you want and big enough to take away all you have. That is still a totalitarian problem, even though in the Western countries we have not reached totalitarianism, but we reach a state where people are afraid to speak up. Talk about big companies these days. We often wish big companies would speak up in defense of capitalism. Well, there are two problems with that. Number one, it's not clear the big companies want capitalism. They're doing pretty well now, so why would they want a more wide open, unpredictable, competitive market? And number two, they may be afraid to speak up. My friends who tried to push term limits about 20 years ago said lots of businessmen said to them, I can't give you money. I can't have my name on a list of people who are trying to limit the terms of members of Congress. They can hurt my business. Today, lots of businesses, particularly financial institutions, have government officers in their workplace all the time. Are they going to speak out against government control, against government regulations, and so on? Not very easily. The system of social democracy that they have in Europe, and that indeed we have to a great extent in the United States, is certainly not totalitarian socialism. It's not Leninism. It's not even Brezhnevism or what they had in East Germany, but it is still inferior to the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. There are going to be new challenges to liberal capitalism all the time. There's never been a golden age of liberty, and there never will be. We're always going to have to struggle for it. We are already seeing various new challenges. In Russia, you have a state essentially controlled by the old KGB with some fascist overtones. And increasingly, if you read Ann Applebaum and Masha Gessen, both in the past couple of days, an ideology of illiberalism that ranges across all the elements of liberalism. In some Muslim countries, you get radical political Islamism. That's a challenge to capitalism. Forms of crony capitalism practiced in countries such as Malaysia and Singapore, some better and worse than others. And in our own country, by a newly energetic interventionism that combines a sort of humanistic socialist appeal with the reality of crony capitalism. And all of them still face these same challenges, the incentive problem, the knowledge problem, the totalitarian problem. And we know that free market capitalism, bolstered by the rule of law, will provide more wealth, more freedom, more harmony in society than any of those things. But we don't have it. We still need to fight for it, defend it, understand it. I hope I've helped you a little bit with that today. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. You have to speak into the microphones for the camera, please.
Steve?
Your dichotomy between socialism and capitalism, and as it developed into social democracy versus capitalism, I wonder if the more easy way to understand for people, the more penetrating way, would be to compare collectivism to individualism. That doing that kind of doesn't let people off the hook when they say, oh, well, we're not socialism. We're involved with social democracy. And they think, oh, well, you can't call us socialist or communist. But the truth is they are collectivist. And even social democracy, I think, is just as collectivist as anything. And I'm just wondering if you think that's a better way to attack this.
Some people like to talk about individualism and collectivism. I think those are less clear terms. I think that you could be a libertarian and still think of yourself as so committed to your family or to your church or to your small community that you don't really think of yourself as an individualist. And you may not see collectivism as a bad thing. And you say, well, they're all collectivists. Okay, they're all collectivists, but then in that sense, you are not making very many analytical distinctions, and I think the analytical distinctions matter. I used to tell a friend of mine many years ago who was a very knowledgeable libertarian who taught me a great deal, and I would listen to him talk about people with different ideas, and I would say to him, you think the whole political system, the whole political spectrum, is divided into anarcho-capitalists, objectivists, classical liberals, limited government libertarians, minarchists, and statists. Well, it's great to see all the distinctions on our side, but there are distinctions on other sides. And so, I don't know, would you consider religious conservatives to be collectivists? They are in some ways, and yet, when we talk about economics, they may not favor what they see as collectivist economics. Well, so, philosophically, I can see the appeal of that. To me, it's not as useful an analytical tool.
I might say that I think there's a difference between the Ayn Rand collectivism, where it's personal, where it's a total philosophy, and the idea of using what I'm saying, individualism versus collectivism, as defining, separating political philosophies, as opposed to just these all-encompassing philosophies, the way Ayn Rand would use the term.
Well, okay, some people like those terms. They just don't appeal to me as much. Behind you?
Thank you. My name is George. I study economics here. I liked the ending of your speech because you talked of crony capitalism. Usually that's a main liberal or leftist concern. I think that there are liberals out there that will, of course, argue the collectivist ideals and the regulation ideals, but I do agree with them that there is crony capitalism that exists, and like you said, there are corporations out there who have people that are in government, and then in many instances they choose to compete politically as opposed to compete economically. So I think that leftist concern still stands. I'm still not convinced that their argument is something that it's something I think we should consider seriously.
Right. I'm not sure exactly what leftist argument it is you think. We're against cronyism.
Well, for example, you mentioned Michael Moore's movie, Capitalism, A Love Story, and I'm a libertarian as well, and watching it, I actually agreed with almost everything he said. I didn't agree with his solutions to the issues, but I agreed with the issues themselves. In many instances, a company's private property is not just a company's private property. There's things as externalities and environmental issues. So I think it's a more complicated question than simply saying, well, you do what you wish with your private property and you don't affect anybody else. Well, there's clearly effects happening.
Well, you want to be careful about the word effect. Lots of things affect people. Somebody else courts the woman you're in love with and woos her away. He can have a terrible effect on your life, but he didn't violate any rights. When you talk about the environment, then you may well be talking about violating rights. And so just be careful about words like effect and harm, which can be very vague. We need to talk about something specific. Violated somebody else's rights, took somebody else's entitlement, what he was entitled to, that sort of thing. But on your general point about crony capitalism, you're right. I think maybe libertarians and even sort of free market conservatives have not done as good a job as we should of making it clear that we're against that kind of so-called capitalism. And then there's an interesting question. Maybe we shouldn't use the word crony capitalism. We should just say cronyism. Because if we want to use the word capitalism, and there are plenty of people who say, let's just not use the word capitalism, it's not what we favor. We should say free markets or freed markets or free enterprise or whatever. But if we're going to use the word capitalism, then we should say what you're talking about when you say crony capitalism is not capitalism at all. It's corporatism, or it's cronyism, or it's favoritism. It's dirigism, to use the French term for directing the way an economy operates, possibly not in a comprehensive way, but just directing resources to individual companies or individual industries. So I really should remember to say cronyism, and that's what we're against, and that is absolutely people who want the government to have the power to direct the economy. They're the ones who are responsible for cronyism.
I just want to follow up with that. So I think both liberals and market conservatives and libertarians argue for economic justice, essentially no favoritism. Right, you speak of how we should phrase our arguments, but I think the point is that both sides should really focus on the justice aspect of it, because what we're really arguing is economic freedom, but equality in economic freedom, and that doesn't exist. The market really isn't free. So I don't like that rhetoric that free market people often use. Well, in the free market, they understand all those things. They are true. But the reality of the situation is that the market isn't free, and there are impediments by market actors in the market.
Well, those are things to think about. We believe in free markets and equal freedom under law. We consider that to be justice. Most of the people who say economic justice, I don't think they're advocating economic freedom and equal freedom under law. That doesn't mean they're wrong about everything. They may have some legitimate points about the environment, the way we deal with environmental issues, and they certainly have some legitimate points about the way the big corporations manipulate the political system. They think you can solve that problem by making the political system more powerful. We tend to think that's a bad approach to reducing the power of corporations over the political system. But I don't think we should delude ourselves into thinking that means we're really in agreement because we both favor justice. Yes. Wait for the microphone. Oh, okay, back there first. I'm sorry.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Last week we had a speaker, former Congressman Robert Ingersoll, who was a person on the right who was talking about climate change and potential market solutions to climate change. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about market solutions to climate change.
Well, I think that's a complicated subject, and I don't know much about it. The first question, it seems to me, is whether climate change is a problem. We have a climatologist on the staff of the Cato Institute, and he's widely published in climate journals. He knows a lot. He says the Earth is warming. It's partly man-made. It's not catastrophic. It's not going to be a serious problem. He might also say, some people who hold that view say, if it's a problem, it's going to be a problem a long time from now. And if we maintain a reasonably free market economy with easy taxes and a tolerable administration of justice, then our descendants will be much richer than we are. So maybe by then they'll have technology that will solve these problems without any huge costs. And if huge costs are required, then they'll be richer. So maybe they should make the decision about whether it's worth that cost. So the first thing for libertarians, it seems to me, is to say, we have to be convinced that there is actually a serious problem to be solved. Then we should also look, maybe not afterward, we can also be looking at, are there ways that our current arrangements of environmental rights are misplaced? And is that one of the things that's causing global warming? In that case, we should change that because the rights have been misplaced. Most of the proposals being advanced to stop global warming are extremely costly to economic freedom and to economic growth. And so we ought to be very cautious. I know that Congressman Inglis is committed, I guess, to cap and trade and carbon taxes, and I'm unconvinced that those things are necessary. One of the problems is it is hard to define property rights in air and water. And we've gotten it wrong in a lot of ways. Originally, we got it wrong in order to enhance economic growth. Courts said, if we really demand that you respect other people's air and water, then you won't be able to build railroads and steel plants and so on, so we should kind of overlook that. 100 years later, we look at it and say, gee, maybe now we need to give people more rights to clean air and water, but it's a difficult thing to do. And so I think we need more thinking about that. But I don't think rushing into expensive things like cap and trade and carbon taxes, which are market-oriented in the sense that they employ market mechanisms, rather than simply banning certain kinds of industrial activity, but they're hardly libertarian market approaches. So I'm not convinced yet that we need any of those kinds of solutions, but we need to be studying these kinds of things.
I just finished reading a biography of Margaret Thatcher by Campbell. I think it was published around 2000, something like that. But Margaret Thatcher obviously was able to reverse most of the manifestations of socialism that existed at the time she took office. But the National Health Service apparently was only just sort of messed around with on the edges. Do you have any feeling that the author of the biography didn't really shed any light on why that was the exception? Any idea why that was the exception, why she really didn't make much progress there?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with you that she got rid of most of the other manifestations of socialism.
She privatized a lot of the national industry.
She did privatize a lot, but you said most, and I don't know that I concede that. Some. She did privatize some things. She privatized some public housing, I guess British Rail, maybe British Air. Yeah, there were definitely things. On the other hand, the things we don't even think about as being socialist, like the schools, she didn't touch them. And I remember noticing some years into Thatcher's tenure, and I'm not sure that I followed it since then, that government spending as a percentage of GDP had actually risen under Margaret Thatcher's rule.
That was
So,
born out of the biography.
that's not exactly privatizing the society. But why couldn't she do anything about the National Health Service? For whatever reason, Britons seem very enamored of the national health. They think it is one of their great achievements. A lot of critics say there are a lot of problems with the British national health, but they probably read in their newspapers about how many problems there are with the American free market health system. Now, we know that America doesn't have a free market health system, but that's what it says in the Times of London. So they think that comparing it to the cowboy capitalism of America's free market system, where people die in the streets every night, they have a better system. We had a debate at Cato a few years ago about the national health, where the defender, who was an American who had lived over there, said, it's great, you know, you break your arm, you just walk in there and they fix your arm. Sure, I mean, if you get cancer or something, you'd rather be in the United States, but I mean, for day-to-day things. The other guy who was critical of it, a Brit, said, well, that doesn't seem like a very good argument. It's easy to walk in and get free stuff done, but if you're actually sick, then you'd rather be in the United States. That's not a healthcare system I would want. I think the basic thing is once you have promised a benefit to people, even if it's not a very good benefit, they get used to it. It's very hard to take it away. This is the terrible problem with Obamacare. It got passed. A majority of Americans were against it. Congress only barely passed it on a party line vote. A lot of people think, boy, when the Republicans get in, they will repeal the hell out of that thing. Well, I don't have any hope that they will repeal Obamacare, because once they're claiming, I think 6 million people have signed up as of today. That's 6 million people. It's probably not actually, but it's some number who will not want their benefits taken away. And the same thing was true of Medicare and Medicaid and then Medicaid prescription drugs, Medicare prescription drugs. Imagine running for president saying that Medicare prescription drug benefit was too expensive. It's not good for our economy. You want to put people back to work? I'm going to repeal that. No candidate would try. Rand Paul is not going to talk about that. So it's very difficult to take things away from people, partly because everybody likes getting stuff they think is free, and partly because people are cautious about the unknown. They don't know what would happen in Britain if they didn't have the national health. They probably also remember that healthcare was much worse in England before the National Health Service, because it was a much poorer, less technologically advanced society. So it doesn't mean it was actually a better system. It does mean, gosh, I remember my grandmother got an abscessed tooth and she died, and that wouldn't happen today. Well, it's true, it wouldn't happen. Even in a bad healthcare system, we can solve a lot of problems that we wouldn't have solved before. We solve them partly because we still have some systems that are less regulated, less nationalized than the British system. But it's very difficult to take things away from people, and the best examples we have of rolling back the welfare state have generally been countries that ran into crisis, like New Zealand. Recently, there have been interesting changes in Canada and Sweden. Both of those countries have noticeably rolled back their entitlement states. Canada, the percentage of GDP taken by government in Canada has done this, while in the United States it's done this, and we've just pretty much touched. So all this, you know, the Canadians view America as cowboy capitalists. We've always viewed them as simpering socialists. But turns out we're now right about the same percentage of GDP taken by government. In both of those cases, Sweden and Canada, there's been very little ideological agreement that things needed to change. It's been a purely practical, pragmatic, balance sheet driven change. And that's good. I mean, it's good that they've made some positive changes, but it doesn't suggest much philosophical change in those countries, and that continues to be a problem. How we persuade people that we really would be better off in the absence, both in terms of freedom and in terms of standard of living, if we got rid of a lot of these semi-socialist programs.
David, can you comment on the extent to which things changed in Russia economically in terms of their system after the dismantling of the Soviet Union?
You know, 25, 30 years ago, I talked to a guy who'd actually been trained at NYU's Austrian economics department, and he'd been doing business in East Asia for some years. And, you know, I knew that Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore were all booming compared to China and even compared to the United States. And he said something about them being crony capitalist countries. He might have even said crony fascist, I don't remember. And I said, well, they're growing pretty fast. And he said, look, crony capitalism works a lot better than socialism. It's still cronyism over there, but it's true. If you have a general reliance on private business and market exchange, you'll get faster growth than if you have socialism like they do in China, and pretty much like they did in India back then, which would have been the other thing. So, what's happened in the Soviet Union? Well, they had a clumsy Radar O'Reilly style of socialism in the 1980s. No growth. Took our economists and our CIA a long time to realize just how poor they were over there. Then communism collapsed, 1989 to 1991. What happened? Well, one of the things that happened in Russia, and this was not true everywhere, was they basically handed off big parts of the state to the people who came to be known as the oligarchs. And suddenly there are more billionaires in Russia than there are in France or England, because they got the various state monopolies, the oil monopoly, I'm not expert on this, so I don't know specifically which monopolies, probably steel monopolies and automobile monopolies. So since then, they have been more like a crony fascist, or in some sense crony capitalist country, and clearly standard of living has risen, especially in the in the Western Soviet Union or Western Russia, St. Petersburg, Moscow, that area. I know less about what's going on in the vast Asian part of Russia. So it's clearly better. It's been better in terms of free speech as well. People don't sit around in bars worrying that if they say anything critical, they will be picked up by the police state. Increasingly, you can't say anything critical on television. Increasingly, though not as much so, you can't say anything critical in newspapers. The web is still a little uncertain. People are circumspect, but not entirely circumspect. And the economy has muddled along. They clearly have had growth. Some of the growth has been because there's been a natural resources boom in the world, and so Russia's oil and other natural resources have brought wealth into the country, and a lot of that wealth goes to the oligarchs and to the Putin clique, but more of it has been spread around than happened in Soviet times. So I don't think there's any question that economically they are better off. They have some more reliance on private ownership of capital. I think they've mostly privatized housing, and that obviously pays big dividends. So it's better, but it's a long way from even Sweden or the United States. The Swedish economist Anders Åslund, or maybe I'm thinking of Jeffrey Sachs, but anyway, people who are not considered on the right or anything, told Eastern Europeans back around 1989, you do not need to worry about whether you're headed toward the Swedish system or the American system. You need to end state socialism. Socialism in land, in housing, in commercial real estate, in the ownership of large corporations, the ownership of small corporations. Once you do all of those things and you start producing some wealth, then you can argue about how big a welfare state you may want. But you're a long way from being able to see any distinction between the Swedish model, the French model, the American model. So, like I say, I'm no expert, but I think it's pretty clearly more of a crony capitalist model, which is definitely better than a state socialist model for producing economic growth.
So my question kind of goes back to what you were talking about rolling back like social democracy and the size of government, specifically in the United States. How does that happen when, like you said, with things like healthcare, people want when there's sort of an entitlement culture, I guess, or where people want the free stuff, and the government itself is kind of trending towards getting larger rather than getting smaller. I mean, how does that reverse itself?
Well, that's a good question. There have been examples in human history like the American Revolution and the abolitionist movement and the abolition of the Corn Laws in England. There was a general movement in the world toward free trade after World War II. We didn't get to perfect free trade, but we got to lots more free trade than we had in the lead up to World War II. Some of that was intellectual. Some of it was purely pragmatic, politicians who realized there'd be more growth, and that was of interest to them. We do need to change the minds of enough people to make them want a different kind of political and economic system. And I think there are many roads to doing that. It's good if more people learn basic economics, and whether that's in high school or college or wherever, if every student was required to take basic economics, even from bad economists, they'd have to learn a little bit about incentives and trade-offs, and that would be a good thing. It would be good if more people understood a little political philosophy, even at the simple level of reading the Declaration of Independence and thinking about what it says. Better schools might be a way of doing that. But how do we get the better schools without getting the ideological change first? That's a challenge. Intellectually, there is a role, I think, for many different approaches. There's the approach of popularizing these ideas on television, like John Stossel, and like increasingly people are doing through internet videos and things like that. But socialists are doing it too, so we don't have an open field. There is a role for high political philosophy and for teaching real economics. There's a role for people who do not compromise in their advocacy of libertarianism. There's also a role for people who try to take libertarian ideas and show how they could improve public policy. The Cato Institute, one of the things we're most known for is a Social Security privatization plan, which would move us from the Social Security system we've got to one in which people would save money in privately managed, in privately capitalized, individually managed plans. Privatization of Social Security. Now, depending on how that might get implemented, it would probably still have a lot more government involved than we would think it ought to, but it would still be an improvement over what we have. And ideally, philosophically, one of the things Thatcher thought about privatizing the public housing was not just that people would take better care of it, but that when people became homeowners, they would start to think of themselves as people with assets to protect, and they would be more likely to vote conservative rather than vote labor. If people came to be owners of large IRAs, 401ks, or whatever would come out of this Social Security privatization plan, hopefully they would start thinking of themselves as people who have a stake in the growth of the American economy and would therefore be more critical of schemes in Washington that would hurt the growth of the economy. So there was a political aspect of that too, not necessarily that they would be more likely to vote Republican, but that both Republicans and Democrats would have to move somewhat in a market direction if there was public support for that. We can also look at the Swedish and Canadian examples, but it's hard to find good lessons there. So I think I don't have a silver bullet for any of this, which is why I'm in favor of lots of different approaches and lots of different venues, from the classroom to the policy shop to the television and so on. But no, it's hard to point to a good example of a modern welfare state where people came to reject the idea of the welfare state.
David, we have time for one more question.
Well, that's a pretty depressing note, so hopefully there is one more question.
I mean, it's kind of tough incentivizing people to be pro-liberty, because most people aren't really concerned about politics. I mean, they're concerned about their jobs and their paychecks. So education's one way, yeah. I'm not sure what other way there could be. I mean, the ideological way of thinking about it is, well, people shouldn't really be concerned about government. They should be free to pursue whatever they wish. They shouldn't be scared that some new policy is going to cheat them out of their tax dollars, is going to tax them more. Well, of course, that's the ideological way. But my question is, how do we get people incentivized to be active in politics?
In an ideal world, people wouldn't have to worry about politics. But I don't expect ever to be in a world that ideal, and you have to realize if you're not worried about politics, politics will worry about you. And so we probably will always have to be prepared to resist, to defend, to advocate. How do we incentivize people to care about liberty? Well, it's a difficult question. People should care about liberty. They would have more money in their pocket. They would have more control over their own lives. Just being able to choose which school your child goes to, wouldn't that be a good advance in liberty? Being able to choose what you smoke, what you drink, wouldn't that be an advance in liberty? Wouldn't people prefer that? And yet, it appears that that's not good enough. A lot of people are willing not to do that. So we have to try to make the philosophical argument. And then the other thing is, and a lot of people would say this, and I'm not so convinced of this, that technological change is one of the ways the world will change. That competition from new creative destruction enterprises will overthrow the old crony companies, will undermine the benefits of the large institutions. I read a report the other day on the millennials, and it says the millennials are used to having choice in all aspects of their lives, which is why they're mostly for gay marriage. They don't see why you would tell people they can't get married, and they're mostly for marijuana legalization. They can't see why you would tell people what they can smoke, and they don't like big institutions, whether that's big corporations or big churches or big government. At the same time, if you poll millennials, they do tend to favor things like Obamacare. So they don't like big institutions. They see that big institutions have failed, and yet they still say they want to create this huge new institution to run something very important. But there is at least a possibility that it becomes more and more difficult to make big, coercive, comprehensive institutions successful in a world where there's globalized capital and globalized labor markets, and technology moves faster than government can keep up with. You know, years ago, we used to hold seminars and conferences on privatizing the Postal Service at Cato. And we have pictures once from when the Postal Workers Union came to picket against our conference. And we were beating our heads against the wall. Nothing ever happened. Postal Service had 800,000 employees in every congressional district in the country, and nothing like this was going to happen. But what has happened? We've stopped using the Postal Service. It still exists. Doesn't have 800,000 employees anymore. It's down to like 550,000. They didn't fire anybody. They just didn't replace everybody who aged out. So maybe things like that will happen, and we'll just use email, and we'll keep on paying. I mean, I still pay some bills by mail. It feels kind of stupid. And it's not as many as it used to be. And I assume other people, I assume out there, you know, if my parents were alive, they'd be paying their bills by mail. But soon, everybody who's paying their bills by mail won't be alive. And so that will change. What about education? There are so many ways you could get education today that don't involve going to a government school for 6 hours a day. But I'll tell you, I was reading my book, Libertarianism, a Primer, which you should all read, which I published 17 years ago, and I was reading it the other day to update it and revise it for publication next year, and one of the things I noticed was how optimistic I was that the K through 12 and higher education monopolies were going to be eroded by school choice and homeschooling and technology and corporations getting into education business. Not much of that has happened in 17 years, but I'm still optimistic that starting now, there's lots more opportunities. It's just crazy that we can't find better technological ways to do education. Every form of information transfer in our society has changed radically in the past 20 years, except the Postal Service and the schools. In the case of the schools, you still have to send your kids there, and almost everybody goes along with that, and they still do it. In the case of the Postal Service, they have a monopoly, and they've lost most of their market share because we found a new technology, and we just went around, and it was easier and cheaper. Schooling, we haven't found that. So that's still a challenge. But maybe the answer is going to turn out to be technology. That's a little more optimistic than the last question, so I'll stop there.